There is a specific moment when fear stops being an instinct and becomes a philosophy. A moment when you realize that the face you are looking at, the face of someone you have known your entire life, might be a lie. We trust our eyes because we have no other choice. We trust that when we see our grandfather walking by the fence, it is actually him. We trust that when we see a cat moving through the grass, it is a living animal. But what happens when the world around you starts to fail? What happens when the reality you live in begins to glitch like a corrupted video file? This is not a story about ghosts haunting a house. This is a story about something much worse. It is about an intelligence that is learning to wear our skin. An intelligence that watches us from the tree line, studying our movements, recording our voices, and practicing how to become us. I used to believe that the worst thing that could happen in the woods was running into a jaguar or stepping on a snake. Physical dangers, things that bleed and die. But I was wrong. The true horror of that land was not biological, it was ontological. It was the dismantling of the truth. The events I am about to describe tested my sanity in ways that no physical threat ever could. Because when you see a loved one walking in the field, and seconds later you find them asleep inside the house, your mind does not just get scared, it breaks. It fractures. And in that fracture, the terror creeps in. After the violent days of the whirlwinds and the discovery of the bones in the creek, the energy of the farm shifted. It was no longer an aggressive, explosive force. It became quiet, insidious. It felt like the forest had stopped screaming and started whispering. It was a heavy silence, the kind of silence that feels like pressure in your ears. My grandmother was the first to notice the change. She was a woman of the earth, her hands were always busy with the soil, with the cattle, with the cycles of life. She knew the rhythm of that place better than anyone. And she knew when the rhythm was off. She began to tell me about the echoes. Not the acoustic echoes of a shout bouncing off a canyon wall, but echoes of time. She told me about a neighbor, a man who had lived on the land next to ours years before. He was a simple man, a creature of habit who found comfort in routine. Every single day, at the exact same hour, he would walk into the bamboo grove, the taquara patch, to cut wood for his stove. In our region, bamboo is essential, it is used for fences, for cleaning chimneys, for construction. The sound of cutting bamboo is unmistakable. It is a hollow, dry crack, followed by the long, rustling sigh of the leaves as the stalk hits the ground. One afternoon, my grandmother was in the kitchen, and she heard it. Crack. Swish. Crack. Swish. The rhythm was perfect. She looked out the window and there he was. The old neighbor, wearing his faded straw hat, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the years, walking slowly among the bamboo. It was a scene of absolute normalcy. A man doing his work. She watched him for a moment, feeling the comfort of the familiar. But reality has a way of pulling the rug out from under you when you least expect it. Later that same day, she met the neighbor on the road. He was clean, dressed in fresh clothes, looking rested. She asked him, casually, making conversation, if he had finished his work in the woods early that day. He stopped, looked at her with a furrowed brow, and said something that made the blood freeze in her veins. He said, "I haven't been to the woods today. I haven't been to the bamboo patch in weeks." My grandmother stood there on the dusty road, looking at a man of flesh and blood, while her mind replayed the image of the man she had seen in the woods. The man who was solid, who cast a shadow, who made sound, but who did not exist. Years later, after that neighbor had died and was buried in the village cemetery, the sounds continued. On quiet afternoons, when the wind died down, we would hear it. The hollow crack of the machete hitting the bamboo. The rustle of the leaves. The forest had recorded him. It had captured his routine, his essence, and it was playing it back on an endless loop. A ghost not of a soul, but of a memory. A residual haunting etched into the very atmosphere of the valley. But echoes of the dead are one thing. We can rationalize them. We can tell ourselves it is just energy trapped in the stone. What is much harder to accept, what makes you question your own sanity, is when the forest starts to mimic the living. The phenomenon of the doppelganger, the spiritual double, is found in folklore all over the world. The Nordics call it the Vartiger, a spirit that arrives before you do. But what we experienced was not spiritual. It felt predatory. It felt like a test. It happened to my cousin. She was a teenager at the time, full of life, skeptical of the old stories. She was walking with two friends near the edge of the property, an area that had been cleared for pasture but where the ancient roots still slept beneath the grass. It was a bright day, sunlight flooding the valley, leaving no room for shadows or tricks of the light. As they walked, they saw him. My grandfather. He was walking near the fence line, checking the wire, inspecting the posts, just as he had done every day for 40 years. His gait was distinctive, a slow, rhythmic limp that was as much a part of him as his blue eyes. He was wearing his work clothes, his hat pulled low against the sun. One of the girls pointed and said, "Look, there is your grandfather." They watched him. He seemed absorbed in his task, methodical, calm. He did not look at them. He did not wave. He just walked, solid and real against the green of the pasture. They continued their walk, unbothered, assuming he was just doing his rounds. But when they returned to the main house, the reality of the situation crashed down on them. They walked into the living room and there he was. My grandfather, sitting in his favorite armchair, a book in his lap, dozing off. My grandmother was sewing nearby. My cousin stopped, her face draining of color. She asked, "How long has Grandpa been here?" My grandmother looked up, surprised by the question, and said, "He has been here all afternoon. He hasn't left that chair since lunch." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. If my grandfather was asleep in the chair, who was walking by the fence? What was walking by the fence? We realized then that the entity in the woods was not just replaying the past. It was observing the present. It was studying us. It was learning our shapes, our movements, our routines. It was trying to blend in. And the most terrifying question of all is, why? Why would a force of nature need to look like an old man checking a fence? Was it practice? Was it a lure? Or was it simply mocking us, showing us that our identity, our physical form, was nothing more than a costume it could wear whenever it wanted? This brings a primal fear to the surface. The fear of the imposter. The idea that the person standing next to you, the person you love, might not be who they seem. That the thing in the field looks like them, moves like them, but behind the eyes, there is only the cold indifference of the forest. We started to watch each other more closely after that. We started to second-guess our own eyes. Is that really him? Or is it the other? The mimic. The mimicry was not limited to sight. It was auditory, and it was loud. It wanted to be heard. There was a specific area of the land, a rough patch of terrain that my uncle had been working on. He was building a new fence, driving heavy wooden stakes into the hard earth. It is brutal, exhausting work. The sound of a sledgehammer hitting wood is distinct, a dull, heavy thud that echoes for miles in the valley. One evening, after the work was done and the tools were locked away, we were sitting at the dinner table. The sun had set, and the darkness outside was absolute, the kind of darkness you only find in the deep interior. Suddenly, it started. Bang! 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 The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of the sledgehammer hitting the fence posts. It was coming from the exact spot where my uncle had been working hours before. But it was louder, more violent. It sounded like someone was trying to drive the posts into the center of the earth. My grandmother, a woman who feared very little, stood up from the table. Her face was set in a mask of anger and defiance. She walked to the porch, leaned over the railing, and shouted into the darkness, demanding to know who was there, asking why they were disturbing the peace. The noise stopped instantly. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a predator that has been spotted. We held our breath, waiting, listening. And then, slowly, rhythmically, it started again. But this time, it was slower. Bang! 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 It was mocking us. It was answering her. It was saying, "I hear you, and I don't care." It was a display of power. A demonstration that our rules, our boundaries, our fences, meant nothing to it. The next morning, my uncle went to inspect the fence. He expected to see vandalism. He expected to see the posts smashed or pulled out of the ground. But there was nothing. The dew on the grass was undisturbed. The fence was perfect. No footprints. No tool marks. No sign that anyone had been there. Whatever had been hammering in the night had no hands. It had no hammer. It was pure sound, manifested by a consciousness that wanted us to know it was there. It was a psychological intrusion. A way of telling us that we were never truly alone, not even in the sanctuary of our own home. As I grew older, the phenomena shifted again. It moved from the ghostly and the auditory to something even stranger, something that belongs in the realm of high strangeness and ufology. We began to see things that defied the laws of physics. Things that felt like a computer simulation failing to render an object correctly. We call them glitches, errors in the matrix. My grandmother told me about the white cat, and her story is the perfect example of this absurdity. She was walking in the pasture one afternoon when she saw it. A beautiful white animal moving through the bushes. It moved with the liquid grace of a feline. Its fur was pristine, shining in the sunlight, too clean for a feral animal living in the wild. She felt drawn to it, mesmerized by its beauty. She walked toward it, wanting to see it closer, wanting to touch it. But as she approached, the reality of the object began to destabilize. The shape of the cat wavered, like heat haze on a road. The fur lost its texture, becoming smooth and artificial. And right before her eyes, the animal dissolved. It did not run away. It did not hide. It transformed. It collapsed into itself and became a white plastic bag, floating on a breeze that didn't exist. And then, it vanished completely. There was no bag on the ground. There was no cat. It was as if the phenomenon had scanned her mind, found an image she would like, a cat, and projected it to lure her in. But as she got too close, the projection failed. The resolution dropped. And the image collapsed into something mundane like a plastic bag before deleting itself entirely. This is not a ghost story. Ghosts do not turn into plastic bags. This is evidence of a technology, or a reality, that is fluid, malleable. It suggests that the things we see in the woods are not always biological creatures. They are projections, holograms, masks worn by something that has no shape of its own. I had my own experience with this visual distortion, and it haunts me to this day because of how clinical it felt. One morning I was walking near the tree line when I saw a massive white balloon. It was hovering silently above the tall grass. It was translucent, large, perfectly spherical. It did not bob in the wind like a normal balloon. It held its position with intelligent stability. It was anchored in the air. I ran to the house to get my binoculars, my heart pounding with the thrill of the unknown. I wanted to see what it was. I wanted to see the texture, the material, the details. When I looked through the lenses, I expected clarity. But I got the opposite. No matter how much I adjusted the focus dial, the object remained blurry. The trees behind it were sharp. I could see the individual leaves. The grass below it was sharp. I could see the blade swaying. But the object itself was a smudge in reality. It was actively resisting observation. It was as if my eyes were sliding off of it, as if the light itself was being bent around it to prevent me from seeing its true form. I decided to approach it on foot. I lowered the binoculars and walked toward the spot where it was hovering. I kept my eyes locked on it, afraid that if I blinked it would disappear. But as I got closer, it didn't fly away. It didn't pop. It simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, occupying space, reflecting light, and the next moment there was nothing, just empty air. When I arrived at the spot, there was no temperature change, no smell of ozone, no mark on the ground. It was a phantom object, a glitch inserted into the scenery and then removed when it was no longer needed. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. She used to say, "There are things here that do not want to be seen. They only appear to who they want, when they want." I began to realize that these were not random hauntings. This was a system. A complex, adaptive system. The forest was not just a collection of trees and rocks. It was a living interface. It could record the past like the neighbor cutting bamboo. It could mimic the present like the image of my grandfather. And it could project illusions like the cat and the balloon to test our reactions. It was playful, in a dark, twisted way. It was terrifying. And it was deeply intelligent. I remember a specific incident that tied all these elements together. I was tasked with taking a small religious shrine, a wooden chapel we call a capellinia, to my great-uncle's house. He lived deep in the woods, in a house without electricity, a place where the modern world had not yet arrived. The path to his house was a journey back in time. The trees were older there, the shadows deeper. As I walked, clutching the wooden shrine, I heard the axe again. The rhythmic chopping of wood. Talk. 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 It was close, incredibly close. I could almost feel the vibration in the ground with every strike. It sounded like a giant was felling a tree just a few meters from the path. I stopped and looked around, expecting to see a woodcutter, expecting to see a falling tree. But there was nothing. Just the dense wall of green, and the sound, continuing its rhythmic work, indifferent to my presence. When I finally arrived at my great-uncle's house, I was shaken. I handed him the shrine and asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "Who is working in the woods today?" I heard chopping right by the trail. He looked at me with his pale eyes, eyes that had seen too much solitude, and said simply, "I hear it all the time. Almost every afternoon. But there is never anyone there." He had accepted it. He lived with the invisible workers. He lived with the mimics. He had become part of the ecosystem of the unexplained. Later, driven by a curiosity that outweighed my fear, I walked back to the area where the sound had come from. I stepped off the trail and pushed through the thick undergrowth of bromeliads, the sharp thorns tearing at my clothes. I wanted to find the source. I wanted to find a cut tree, a pile of wood, anything physical to explain the auditory hallucination. I found no woodcutter. I found no axe. But hidden in the dense vegetation, I found a hole. It was not a natural formation. It was a deep, excavated depression in the earth. The soil was fresh, piled up on the sides. It looked like someone, or something, had been digging. Not to bury something, but to come out. It was a tunnel, a passage, leading down into the dark. I stood at the edge of that hole, looking into the blackness, and I felt a gaze looking back at me. I realized then that the sound of the axe might not have been woodcutting at all. It might have been the sound of excavation. The sound of something digging its way up from below. We often think of the supernatural as ghosts in sheets or monsters in the dark. But the truth is far stranger. The truth is that reality is a frequency. And in places like that valley, the signal is jammed. We were living on top of a recording device that never stopped. We were living with neighbors who were not human. We were living with a forest that could wear our faces and speak with our voices. And as we would soon discover, these mimics and glitches were just the guardians. They were the outer layer of defense. Because deep in the woods, on a lonely hill where my great-uncle lived, something else was waiting. Something that didn't mimic humans because it had no interest in being human. Something that appeared as lights in the sky, and left physical marks on the earth. The hole in the ground was just the beginning. The arrowheads were just the warning. The true owners of the land were beginning to stir, and they were getting ready to make their presence known in a way that we could no longer ignore. So the next time you are alone in nature, and the silence falls heavy around you, do not just listen for the snapping twig. Listen for the sounds that shouldn't be there. Listen for the footsteps that match your own. Look closely at the person walking towards you in the distance. Is it really them? Or is it just a shape, a texture, a rendering of a memory? Because the earth is not just dirt and stone. It is a mask. And sometimes, just for a second, the mask slips, and we see the eyes watching us from the dark.
Thank you.